students have played an important role in the national movements in Asia and Africa. In China, though, the students played a very significant role in the political movement since the 1880s. Hello everyone, this is the topic for today's lecture, Students' Movement from 1880 to 1949. I have divided this lecture into 4 parts. In the first part, I am going to talk about the students' movement and the role of Peking University. In the second part, I am going to deal with the May 4th movement and the students' role in it. In the third part, I talk about students' politics in the 1920s and 30s. And in the concluding part, my focus will be more specifically on the students' movement from 1945 to 49. Towards the end of the Manchu rule, as part of one of its reforms, the court had abolished the civil services examination in 1905. No new effective system was in place, and the recruitment process seemed to have been filled in a vacuum. Administratively, China became weakened even more. As imperialist powers encroached further, the government in Peking was involved in political bickerings, manipulation, and power struggle. China remained economically, socially, and politically backward. Forces of change began to emerge in China in the form of youth and intellectuals, students and teachers who created new awareness which eventually changed the Chinese nation for good. It was an intellectual revolution in the first place. Ideas of nationalism, democracy, liberalism, science, socialism, and communism gradually started dominating the intellectual environment. Since the early years of the 20th century, the number of students who had lived abroad and studied increased. Many had acquired education in the West and in Japan. Many young intellectuals were impressed by the Meiji Restoration in Japan, Western science and technology, and had been accepted by many as the panacea for China's illness. All in all, there appeared on the Chinese scene a group of people who were young, educated, politically conscious, socially aware, and progressive in their approach. The 21 demands after the end of the First World War hurt the pride and dignity of these people who reacted through vociferous expressions of nationalist sentiments. Students maintained contact with many Chinese students' associations abroad. Patriotic zeal was a great unifying force. Most students who returned home became active in the anti-imperialist movement. Among other social groups, the small working class, as China's industry was very, very limited, was a natural ally of the students' patriot. In more concrete terms, the forces of change were given a boost with reforms at Peking University and other forms of literary and intellectual activities. Peking University, or Beida, originally named the Imperial University, was founded in 1898. During its fledgling years, it served mainly as a recruiting ground for prospective officials. Even after the revolution of 1911, Beida was still considered to be just a diploma mill for aspiring officials. Students' disinterest in learning was painfully apparent. Spending their time in idleness, or worse, students got through by cramming at exam time. Virtually all pursued diplomas with a single-minded concern for their practical uses. Faculty members' hierarchy was not dependent on their scholarship or teaching abilities but on their position in the Manchu court. Neither students nor teachers encouraged originality or creativity. The reform of Beida was essentially the work of one man, Sei Yuan Pei. Sei Yuanpei had been educated in France and Germany, and also at a very early age he passed the civil service examination. He was a man of great experience who had the experience of two cultures. He quit the civil service examination and joined the revolutionaries in the government of Sun Yat-sen in 1912. He resigned this post when Yuan Shikai became the president. A few years later, the Peking government offered him the post of chancellor of the Peking University, which he accepted. Sei Yuanpei was essentially an educationist, and his accomplishment as the head of this institution earned him the distinction of being called the father of Chinese Renaissance. He appointed the best possible faculty available and budding scholars and researchers in positions who defended the academic freedom from government pressure and made the university a forum for free and open debate, where students and professors were equal participants. Amongst the men he appointed to the various faculties were Chen Tu-sim, Hu Shi, and Li Tao-chao. Two of them later became the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party. With Sei's reform, Baida not only flourished academically but also became the centers for debate and discussion between traditional literate and modern intellectuals. A group of new thinkers emerged. It won the students' support, and together, challenging the conservatism of China, they called for modernization. One of the earliest appointments to Baida was Chen Su-hu as the Dean of the College of Arts. Chen is perhaps best known for his association with the journal The New Youth, which stirred immediate widespread enthusiasm among the youth when it was first published on September 15, 1915. When Chen came to Baida, he brought the journal with him, and in January 1918, it was reorganized and the editorship rotated among Chen and 5 other faculty members. As reflected in its name, this influential magazine was all set to create the new youth. It called on all Chinese youth to be everything which their parents were not, to be progressive, scientific, and independent. It addressed itself to the young men and women educated in the new schools and in the new thought. Many of them had studied in Japan, in Europe, or in the United States. They had been exposed to free exchange of ideas, Eastern and Western, old and new. They knew that 1911 had rid China only symbolically of the old official dome or authority, but China was still an easy mark for imperialist powers. They believed that they had come upon a working, acceptable substitute for the enfeebled and enfeebling orthodoxy. They felt that, as stated simply by Che, the salvation of China lay in a new culture based on science and democracy. It was through the pages of the New Youth that Chen began his attack on Confucianism, and in the early years of the journal, it advocated liberty, equality, and fraternity, the ideals of the French Revolution. Chen later switched to Marxist-Leninist ideology and became the first General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. The impact of the New Youth had on the educated youth or the educated younger generation of China is demonstrated through the very fact that students and intellectuals waited for every issue anxiously to read word by word as if it was a gospel. Debates and discussions on a variety of issues took place through the columns of this journal. Academic and political exchanges of ideas characterized this journal, which became the mouthpiece of China's young, patriotic, socially aware generation. Let us pause for a quiz. Who is known as the father of the Chinese Renaissance? Option 1, Sei Yuanpei. 2, Chen Tu-xiu, Hu Shi, or Mao Zedong. The answer is option 1, Sei Yuanpei. Now let me turn to the second part of my lecture, which is on the May 4th movement of 1919. The demonstration on May 4th, 1919 was organized in protest against the decision of the Paris Peace Conference. The immediate aim of the students was to demonstrate public indignation against the warlords and the national humiliation brought about by the international power politics after the end of the First World War. In a manifesto distributed on the occasion, the students gave a call to all other classes of the society to unite and protest against China's humiliation by the imperialist powers. Soon after the May 4th demonstration, the students of Peking started organizing the new intellectuals in support of their cause. They tried to win over the sympathy of the public by means of publicity, mass meetings, and demonstrations. In the process, they began to establish closer contacts with the masses of illiterate people and secure strong and effective support from the new merchants, industrialists, and urban workers. The new ideas of the students spread to all the cities. The antiquated civilization began to crack up under the pressure of the new socio-political movements. That is why May 4th movement is given a unique place in the history of modern China. The students' movement spread fast throughout China. Peking and Shanghai were the main centers of this protest movement and students' activities. In the first stage of the movement, the Peking students were more prominent. During the first 2 weeks after the May 4th incident, students were busy organizing themselves and established self-government students' organization for carrying out various programs. On May 19th, Peking students went on a strike which spread to other cities. 3 days later, Shanghai students went on strike. They also sought the cooperation of the merchant class and through them to the working class. From this time onwards, Shanghai became one of the most important centers of students' politics. On May 26th, Shanghai students organized a demonstration which attracted about 300,000 observers from the general public. The memorial meeting of May 31st again was attended by more than 100,000 citizens and students. On June 5th, workers and merchants began a strike. This was the first political patriotic strike in Chinese history, one in which the aim of the workers was national salvation and not wage increase or better working conditions. Workers and merchants participated in the movement under the leadership of the students. Through their support to the students' movement, it forced the government to stop its oppressive policies as a class, and they could not make their importance felt. The students made their contemporary leaders feel that they were an important force in the national struggle. In this movement, peasants did not play an important role, for it was confined mostly to the cities. However, most of the students belonged to the villages. In the summer vacation, when they went to the villages, they followed and carried out their campaigns in the villages. Since most of the students belonged to the rich landlord or peasant classes, they seem to have spread their message largely among these classes. The middle, lower, middle, and poor peasants, by and large, were untouched. The campaign could not have been very well organized either because the students belonged to different villages and coordination amongst them was very difficult. For the first time in Chinese history, boys and girl students walked together and actively participated in the same meetings and were organized into a single group. From then onwards, girl students joined the student movement and provided with a vital stimulus. This contributed to the introduction of co-education in China the following year and led to the women's suffrage movement. In the immediate aftermath of the May 4th movement, very few students were active in politics. The vast majority was busy in studies, but their concern among the national welfare continued. When the Whampoa Military Academy was set up, a large number of students went to Canton to join the academy. In a little over a year, the enrollment of the students in the academy increased from 500 to 3,000. Their main aim was to be trained for the Revolutionary Army. Thus, Canton became the Mecca of the revolutionary youth. Among the political active students, those belonging to the Socialist Youth Corps were the most active. They had an aim before them, that is, to mobilize and educate the masses for the revolution. Hence, they went to slums and rubbed shoulders with the proletariats. Consequently, their influence on the masses was more than that of even the CCP. As late as in 1922, Che Tu-hyun admitted that the Youth Corps had much greater influence than the CCP party as a whole. Even Dr. Sun Yat-sen was much impressed by the work of the SYC or the Socialist Youth Corps. The Communists' close association with the radical students was regarded by him as a strong point of the Communist and hence their desired partnership. Now, let me come to the second quiz. The May 4th movement of 1919 was, number one, was a Chinese cultural and anti-imperialist political movement which drew out of students' protest in Beijing. Number two, to protest the Chinese government's weak response to the Treaty of Versailles. Number three, to protest the decision to allow Japan to retain territories in Shandong that had been surrendered by Germany. Or number four, all of the above. The answer is option 4, all of the above. Now I am coming to the third part of this lecture, that is the students' politics from 1920s and 30s. After the formation of the KMT-CCP United Front, the Chinese students were active under the guidance of the United Front government. In the early 1926, there was labor unrest in the Japanese-owned mills in Shanghai. The Japanese mill owners followed a dual policy. On the one hand, they were trying to negotiate agreement with the workers, and on the other side, they were trying to suppress the workers. During the course of these events, Lu Ching-hung, a labor leader, was killed. Immediately aroused the students in Shanghai. The imperialist powers continued their policy of suppression. On May 30th, 1925, some students were arrested, and in the firing that followed, several people were killed and injured. The incident of May 30th was an expression of patriotism and demand for justice from the foreign powers. Unlike the May 4th movement, the May 30th movement was initiated by the workers, and the students cooperated with them and supported this movement. In the May 4th movement, students take the initiative, and only in the later stages did the workers organize sympathetic strikes. But by 1925, workers were well organized and politically conscious. The Socialist Youth Corps, the SYC, later changed into the Communist Youth League, or the CYL, and it played a very important role in the movement. Like the earlier ones, the movement too was marked by students' riots and rallies. During the Northern Expedition, the CIL prepared the ground for the advancing army. The students welcomed the expeditionary army with parades and demonstrations. The students' activities reached its climax in 1927. On April 12th, Chiang Kai-shek's Shanghai coup took place. This was followed by the persecution of the communists, which the students severely criticized. Many leftist students were killed by the KMT forces, and many more deserted the communist organizations. The rest went underground. Now the KMT was forced with the problem of channelizing the activities of the students. The party was divided over the policy to be followed towards the students. One of the group was in favor of combining political work with study, while the other group believed that the students should concentrate on their studies. No definite policy towards students was followed by the KMT till April 1929. On May 30th, 1928, the Jian incident took place. It was a dispute between Chiang Kai-shek's National Revolutionary Army and the Japanese soldiers and civilians in Jinan of Shandong province, which led to armed conflict. Students rose in protest against the Japanese. The KMT government was suspicious of the students and curbed their activities everywhere except in Shanghai, where students were encouraged to carry on anti-Japanese movement and boycott of Japanese goods because it gave the KMT government a weapon for diplomatic bargain. After the Jinan incident, the KMT began a universal program of anti-Japanese education for the students. In January 1930, the Ministry of Training announced two basic laws that dissolved non-academic organizations of students except their self-governing institutions. The students were avoided to active participation in national politics. This led to confusion, differences, and frustrations among the students. At this stage, despite official suppression of communism, its influence seemed to grow among the Chinese students. The secrecy and discipline of the suppressed party appealed to the disillusioned students. The leftists organized demonstrations which were ruthlessly suppressed by the government. The students' movement from September 1931 till January 1932 resulted in utter failure. The reason for this was organizational leadership and its lack of support from other classes of society. But 1935 onwards, the students had new avenues of work. The CCP, after the Long March, established its base in Yan'an, where anti-Japanese university was established. The youth was given ideological education. The students and other young people from all over China went to Yan'an to join this university. In Canton, which was the Mecca for students in the 1920s, Yan'an became their Mecca in the 1930s. In the 1930 period, the unity of students with workers and peasants, which are the two main forces of the revolutionary struggle, was accomplished. During this period, the CCP's impact on the students increased by leaps and bounds. By the 1940s, China already had a well-established tradition of students' activism. Now, there's a quiz. The question is, the May 30th, 1925 movement started from option 1, Beijing, option 2, Yan'an, 3, Shanghai, or 4, Whampoa. The answer is option 3, Shanghai. Now I'm coming to the last part of this lecture, which is students' movement from 1945 to 1949. Conditions in China between 1945 to 49 enhanced the influence of the students' movement and contributed to its specific emphases. In the areas controlled by the central government, the Chinese student movement was essentially anti-war movement. As the civil war progressed during those years, the students' protest became one of the government's major political problems, referred to by Mao himself as the Second Front in the struggle against the Chiang Kai-shek government. During the period, students were involved in scores of individual protest meetings, strikes, and incidents. Some of these developed over political issues, while others were concerned more specifically with academic matters and those related to schooling. But in addition to these more or less isolated protests, there were 4 demonstrations, or students' tides as they were called, or Siai Chao in Chinese. They were sometimes called, which aroused nationwide attention and response. These 4 movements were, number 1, the December 1st movement of 1945 in Kunming was the smallest of these. The second was followed a year later in late December 1946 and early 1947 by the demonstration protesting the violent action of American military personnel in China. The third happened from May and June 1947, called the anti-hunger, anti-civil war movement, which swept through universities and middle schools in major cities within the government-controlled areas. And the fourth, or the last big tide before the communist victory, was the movement to protest American support of Japan, which occurred in May 1948. It was during the course of these 4 series of nationwide demonstrations that students' movement became a major irritant of the central government. Despite the local issues and personalities which could not but play a part in demonstration, as far-flung as these were, the basic concerns which sustained the students' protest were everywhere the same. That was directed against the government. The students' primary demand were an immediate end to the Civil War, an end to the US support of the government in pursuit of that war, and a shift in public expenditure from military to civilian ends. The government denounced the student movement as a creature of the Communist Party. As the conflict between the government and the communists progressed into full-scale war, the authorities became increasingly ruthless in their effort to suppress the students' protest. The major students' movement coincided with the national crisis. The acceptance of the Chinese Communist Party and the rejection of the Kuomintang in the course of the student movement from 1945 to 49 came with the conviction that the Chinese Communist Party and not the Kuomintang could achieve the goals of Chinese nationalism. Transfer of loyalties occurred not because of the attractiveness of the Chinese communist ideology, but because students, activists after 1947 believed only communist victory could bring peace and political unity. Only the leadership of the CCP could restore the centralized and sovereign state, essential for modernization. The student movement of 1945 to 49 helped the Chinese Communist Party gain a ready acceptance as the instrument of a nationalism characterized by anti-imperialism and statism. The basic characteristic of the students' movement in China were, number one, intense political activity on the part of the students marked by idealism and hypersensitivity to the realities of the political situation, which led usually amongst the brightest students and in the best schools. Number two, positive yet moderating support for the students from their professors and teachers. Number three, administrators were caught between their sympathy for the students and the task of dealing with the political environment beyond the present of the campus. Number four, and that the environment itself, a study in local reaction reflecting the policies and orders of the central government and striking with sufficient brutality at the instigators among the students. Number five, extensive publicity from an only partially controlled press. And finally, expression of sympathy for the students from various elements within the general population, strong enough on occasion to force a public statement from President Chiang Kai-shek himself, deploring the unnecessary police brutalities and violence and urging the students to return to their studies. The communist political ideology during the Civil War was that without the broadest united front of the overwhelming majority of the population, it would be impossible to win a victory in China's new democratic revolution. And whatever its deficiencies, Mao regarded the student movement as a vanguard in the work of building a united front. He believed that the upsurge of the student movement will inevitably promote an upsurge in the whole people's movement. But not all party members apparently shared Mao's views concerning the students' revolutionary potential. Many in the Communist Party thus tried to steer a steady course between ideological and practical distrust of intellectuals and the recognized need for a broad support base in their struggle against the KMT government. The gulf between the students and the government widened during the Civil War. All sources agree that a majority of the students were disillusioned with the government and that the greatest causes of this disillusionment were the government's war policy, together with measures adopted to subdue the students' protest movement. But there is little indication except of superficial sort as to what kinds of political alternatives the students sought. 2 points can be made while summing up the students' role in China during the 1940s. First, anti-imperialism, mostly against Japan, motivated the movements, and secondly, which was more prominent, was the anti-KMT pro-communist stand of the movement. The vast majority of the students did not organize any demonstration against KMT's oppressive policy or they did not go directly under the CCP's leadership. They opposed the KMT because the KMT opposed their demands. Now, this is the final quiz. The basic characteristics of the students' movement from 1945 to 1949 was: number 1, anti-communist; number 2, anti-Japanese; number 3, anti-Manchu; and number 4, all of the above. And the answer is option 2, anti-Japanese. Now let me come to the final analysis. The new youth of China were inheritors of the prestige traditionally accorded to the intellectual elite in China. Their sense that they were anointed to guide the people had a precedent in the Confucian state orthodoxy. Despite continuity in the political orientation of the Chinese intellectual elite, the students' movement are a new phenomenon in China and part of the dynamics of modernization. The challenge to tradition by modern Western civilization helped create the conflict of generations in China as in numerous other modernizing societies. After the abolition of the traditional civil service examination in 1905, education in China became more highly institutionalized. Large number of students congregated in the universities in a small number of cities, where they lived in a milieu quite different from both their traditional bound villages and from the family setup. Both the city and the university were examples of a civilization in transition. The Sino-Western hybrid that was the culture of the eastern cities and universities expressed the confrontation of modern industrialized civilization of the West and the great tradition of China. University curricula emphasized Western learning, science, mathematics, the social sciences, and the English language. The importation of Western culture added excitement and exotism to the cities. Commercial and industrial growth brought traditional mores and values into question. After several years at the urban university, many students found it that the gulf between them and their home was almost unbridgeable. They did not want to return to their village society or to their traditional family. They no longer spoke the same language as their fathers who were educated in the Confucian ideology spoke. Even the sons of the urban business community criticized their fathers for maintaining the traditional social ethics in their personal life, while adopting the capitalist ethic in their economic relationship. Youth who had recently discovered Marxism and Leninism were criticizing their semi-westernized elders. The Kuomintang, which rose to power under the banner of the revolutionary nationalism in 1927, was criticized by the youth in the 1930s for its compromises with tradition and its slowness in building a powerful and prosperous China. Study of the Chinese students' movement provides insights into Chinese history as well and into the nature of students' activism. The issues which politicized Chinese students were nationalism and statism. compromise with tradition or with imperialism constituted unforgivable sins in the eyes of the new youth. The USA came increasingly to represent Western imperialism during the course of the Chinese movement between 1945 and 49. Through US support of the Kuomintang, it also became a symbol of Western or forces of conservatism and anti-communism. The student movement, by making the US a major focus of protest, contributed to an anti-American tradition which the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, inherited and later used in their own ideology and official propaganda. That's it. Thank you.